this is Miss Wicker coming to you from the prairies of western Minnesota, where I am working with the Echinacea project. Today we're going to talk to Amy and learn a little bit about a project that she has going on that looks a little into the genetic factors influencing the Echinacea angustifolia, which is our model species that we look at in the prairies here. Let's go talk to Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Wananen. I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, and I'm here in Kensington, Minnesota, where I study prairies. Prairies in this area are very fragmented, which means they're really far apart from each other and they're really isolated. So the question that I had was, what would happen if we reconnected the prairies? One way this could happen is if bees carry pollen between different isolated patches of plants. We don't know how much this happens, but I wanted to know what would happen if it was possible. So the question I'm asking this summer is, what happens when pollen moves from different populations to another? And I came up with this question because we know that habitat fragmentation is really bad for a lot of populations. When they're small, they tend to get smaller. And so if we reconnect them, the idea is that they might function as a larger population and do a lot better. If you're trying to come up with questions, some advice that I would have for you is to think about what you really care about in the natural world around you. So I really care about prairies, and I notice that they're really small, and in fact a lot of them are getting smaller all the time. And so because I really care about them, I try to think about ways that they might be more sustainable in the future. And so that's how I came up with this question. So I think starting with something that you really care about is a great way to start. Alright, so to learn about my question, once I had figured out what my question was, I went to Google Scholar and I tried to figure out if anyone had asked this kind of question before. And so what I did is I started searching for just some kind of general questions like outcrossing distance or pollen movement, and then after I read a few papers, and I sort of refined those search terms so that I could find better sources that were more relevant for the kinds of questions I had. I used Google Scholar rather than just regular Google because Google Scholar brings up all of the peer-reviewed published papers. So these are ones that other scientists have published, and they've gone through a process of peer review to make sure that they have followed the scientific method properly and have results that contribute to our knowledge in a credible way. So I actually had two hypotheses for my question. One is that outcrossing distance might improve offspring fitness, because if parents that are close together are more closely related, they might have, and they're exchanging pollen, they might have inbred offspring that have low fitness. On the other hand, parents that are far apart might have genes that are adapted to different environments. So crossing those parents might end up with an offspring whose fitness is just somewhere in the middle and isn't very good. So I had these alternative hypotheses, one that outcrossing distance would improve offspring fitness and one that it would decrease offspring fitness. And the project that I'm doing will be give me results to say which of those hypotheses is better supported than the other. Okay, so to test my hypotheses, I'm doing an experiment where I take pollen from different populations and move them around to focal plants that are different distances away from the pollen donor. What this involves is collecting pollen in the morning and then bringing it to a pollen recipient that I've assigned randomly. Something that I have to be really careful about with my methods is to make sure that I am going to be pollinating seeds with just the pollen that I want and none of the other pollen that's out in the environment. So this means I have to put on pollinator exclusion bags on all of the focal plants that will be receiving pollen. And I have to be very careful to make sure it's not contaminated by other sources of pollen. So that's one challenge that I've had to really work on, making sure that, I am careful with conducting my crosses so that I can really know what the source of variation in offspring fitness is. At the end of the season, I'll collect the seeds and then plant them in an experimental plot. And then in the future, I'll measure those seedlings as they grow and germinate and then eventually produce their own flowers and seeds. So then I'll be able to say which parents and which distance apart parents have the highest fitness offspring. Something that's really important about planning this experimental plot is that I'm not just planting all the siblings together in one spot and, you know, all of the seeds that look really big or nice in the nicest spots in the experimental plot. So instead, I'm being really careful to randomize so that I know that any variation in offspring fitness is due to their different backgrounds with their parents rather than any bias that I might have had as a researcher. So this work is still ongoing, so I don't have any results from this crossing experiment yet, but we do have some preliminary results from other experiments that suggest that parents that have greater distances between them have higher fitness offspring. So what this means is that improving landscape connectivity could be really important for improving the fitness of native plant populations and making sure that they will persist even as climate change and other global changes threaten the persistence of natural populations. All right, once I have my results, I'm really excited to share them really broadly. So I want to share them with both the scientific community, so other people who might be interested in similar questions as me would be really interested in knowing my results and the kinds of approaches that I used to answer the questions that I had. I also want to be sure to share my results with different people who make decisions about landscapes so that they can actually apply the results that I've generated to real-world problems. Part of what this will involve is both, publishing papers that will get posted on Google Scholar or all the other sources of primary literature that you can find, but also going out and talking to people who are, maybe not scientists or maybe who don't have access to all of the scientific publications that you can find. So giving presentations and writing for different kinds of audiences. I'm collecting a lot of data, which I'll describe in papers, but other scientists might be interested in actually working with the data. So my goal is to actually publish the data sets from the work that I'm doing online in a data repository so that somebody else might be able to use these data in the future.
Thank you, Amy, for telling us about your project looking into the genetics of the Echinacea here in these fragmented prairies, and for showing us how your project followed the steps of the scientific method. We're going to be looking at a bunch of different projects going on here in the prairie, and you'll notice that all of them, regardless of what they're about, they're going to follow those scientific method steps. So thank you, Amy, and we're looking forward to seeing what your results are. Stay tuned for more results from Amy.